The element for Red Deer Lacombe.
Red Deer Mountain View.
Oh, sorry, Red Deer Mountain View, yes.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I also want to thank my colleagues for their remarks and contributions to this debate. The very fact that we can debate here in this House on this matter, it is so important for Canadians, is something that our veterans fought for. The right for civil debate is something that we must always cherish and hold with reverence equivalent to the sacrifice required to attain it. And as we all wear our poppies this November, I want to say thank you to the men and women who have served our military and continue to serve our country in such a capacity. Madam Speaker, the last time that I was here in this House speaking to this issue, I was able to draw on much of my teaching experience to highlight just how important this motion is. This motion that we, of course, all know by now is concerning this government's refusal to provide all files, documents, briefing notes, memoranda, emails, or any other correspondence engaged among government officials regarding SDTC or this NDP-Liberal government's Green Slush Fund. And while I don't want to belabor the point of discussing how this government could learn lessons from high school students in finally coming clean to Canadians on yet another scandal, today I want to frankly try to appeal to this government's better angels by asking them to make a decision. Today I'm asking this government on behalf of the many parents and young bright students of the future that I represent to set a good example and once again come clean to Canadians on this scandal. As the Prime Minister may remember, children look up to us adults for influence, inspiration, and as role models. And while it sometimes remains to be seen that this is the case, we are all indeed adults in this House. And with the added responsibilities of being parliamentarians, elected representatives of our people, our nation, the bar only gets higher. In search of role models, children look for those who lead by example. And once again, this government has a choice to make. It can come clean with Canadians on this corruption-stricken slush fund and the lack of stewardship over taxpayers' dollars, or continue to allow our House to be frozen and in dysfunction in service of their questionable political goals. They have a choice to place the sake of Canadians over themselves. Now, I'm not ignorant to the reality the political parties of all stripes will attempt to paint their opponents in an unflattering manner. But in this case, among many others, Madam Speaker, putting political interests over Canadians has become an absolute reality in what remains of this NDP-Liberal government. And I intend to make this point here in this House today. It's clear to Canadians, now more than ever, that this government has adopted a doctrine of do as I say, not as I do. In 2015, the Liberal Party put out this message in campaigning efforts, and I quote, "Canadians deserve an open, transparent government that will focus on their real priorities, economic growth that works for everyone. Only Liberals have a plan for real change that will restore trust in our democracy and ensure an open and transparent government," to end that quote. After 9 years of this government, trust in our democracy and the transparency of government has never been lower. Recent numbers show that at least 6 in 10 Canadians are not satisfied with the accountability and transparency of the Canadian government's spending practices. And while polls are not gospel, I must ask those opposite, is this not the slightest bit concerning? This theme extends beyond just the realm of this green slush fund. while NDP-Liberals pull out all of the stops to virtual signal on how great their climate plan has been and how great it has been for Canadians, they have failed to hit a single emissions reduction target. And according to the Auditor General, they are unlikely to hit their 2030 targets either. There is something to be said about sticking to what you say you will do. It's a matter of integrity and, frankly, pride. And I'm routinely surprised by the lack of shame demonstrated by this government's many shortfalls. And of course, this all comes as the ever-present carbon tax continues to hurt Canadians at the pumps and at the grocery stores. As I described earlier, do as I say, not as I do. It creates a clear double standard that this government can do no wrong, while they continue to attack industries in my home province of Alberta for easy political points with their ever-diminishing voter base. The government's recent announced emissions cap for the oil and gas sector is a blatant attempt to strangle an industry that is, frankly, critical to Canada's economic prosperity and growth. And the irony is that while they continue to fail to hit their own emission targets, they expect provinces and industries within said provinces to now follow a new arbitrary production cap. So how is that not a double standard?
Good question.
Recent data from Stats Canada shows that energy-rich Alberta contributes 38.2% to the overall natural resources GDP in 2022. And let it be known from coast to coast that Albertans take incredible pride in how we do energy. We excel in planning and executing reclamation processes to return the land we use back to how it looked and how it was used before development upon the land took place. The notion that Albertans are anti-environment is simply untrue and reeks of anti-Alberta prejudice. The ability to harness Canada's natural resources is truly a Canadian superpower, and by extension, it makes Alberta an all-star. The energy sector is a massive contributor to employment in central Alberta, and applying a de facto emissions cap would be devastating to those employed in my riding. Now, I'm a fourth-generation farmer. I work hard to represent fellow farmers here in the House, and on top of that, the people of Red Deer Mountain View have placed their trust in me as their elected representative to advocate for their voice at Ottawa. And I not only cherish this trust, but will fight for their interests as long as I have the honour of representing them in the House of Commons. On that note, I want to shift my focus back to this government. And I wanted to turn attention specifically to the honourable member opposite, who sits as Canada's Minister of Environment. I do this because this individual announced this de facto production cap on our oil and gas sector. And while he has stated reasons of his own, I wish to highlight an alternative explanation for not only this cap, but this government's reluctance to disclose documents that would expose the corruption that has taken place. If one were to open up the books and look at the Environment Minister's working history, they will see that he was a strategic advisor for more than 10 years at a Canadian fund dedicated to the development of clean technologies. Now, gee, you might say, that sounds awfully familiar, given the matter that has had this House seized for about a month now. What was the SDTC? Right. It was also a Canadian fund dedicated to the development of clean technologies, except this was run by the federal government of Canada. And while that is the case, it goes even deeper than that. For those that are unfamiliar with the matter, one of the directors of this very fund found their way on the board of SDTC. And on top of that, this green slush fund has had a history of giving money to companies in the portfolio of the fund that our industry minister or our environment minister used to work at. The saying often goes that people in government should always strive to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest as a means to ensure that faith and trust in our institutions remain strong. It's bizarre, then, that any person armed with a handy little tool called Google is able to find out that there are so many layers to the corruption we are attempting to uncover. As members of Parliament, we represent our constituents, but not only them, we represent ourselves. That's true. That is a fact of human nature. And as I outlined before, I have no qualms about telling people where I come from, the honest work that I do in our beautiful farm in Red Deer County, and the interest I represent on behalf of those in my riding. But it seemed that this forthcomingness is not a characteristic that is shared by some of those who sit opposite of myself and my colleagues. And that is, of course, what we are discussing here today. And it leaves so many questions unanswered. What other interests does this government hold that they continue to conveniently cover up for their own political gain? Once again, do as I say, not as I do. This narrative has become tiring for everyone in Canada. That much is absolutely clear. Whether it is Conservatives who have been steadfast in our efforts to prosecute this government for its many shortcomings and dishonesties, to Canadians, or whether it is Canadians themselves who are fed up and have had enough with this NDP-Liberal government. Something needs to change. When scholars look back at this tumultuous period within the Liberal caucus and the many uncertainties that have come with it, I worry that their takeaways will be less than charitable. Whatever happened to setting a good example for our children, for teaching them the importance of accountability for one's actions? Whatever happened to showing your homework when presenting proposals to chief executives? And as a reminder, here in this House, the chief executives over all of us are the Canadian taxpayer who sent us here. Our responsibility is to them, to the people who pay for us to sit here in this House, while some twiddle their thumbs pretending that there isn't a massive cover-up taking place here. There will be a carbon tax election around the corner. But for now, this government is still hanging on, despite the fact that so many Canadians across the political spectrum are telling this Prime Minister that he's not worth the cost, the crime, and the corruption. But now I'll move away from indicting this government's actions, because I did want to say that I wish to appeal to the better angels here today. As many of my peers in the teaching profession and in the scholarly realm will often say, history is the best teacher. And when we look back on history, there is an abundance of literature and cases that show that the truth always comes out in the end. The truth prevails, no matter how powerful the efforts are to suppress it. And the reality is that we even see this in recent history, even as recent as the past couple decades. So the truth, whether this government likes it or not, is going to come out sooner or later. And just like always, if you have nothing to hide, why bother? But on the flip side, if you do have something to hide, you'd be better off coming clean sooner rather than getting burned twofold when the truth comes to light without your hand in it. History is the best teacher. And as with all governments, this government will sometime in the near future become just that, history. And when it does, as with all governments that come and go, it will be subject to the 2020 vision that is hindsight and held to the level of scrutiny that 2020 vision can grant. This, Madam Speaker, is what we call legacy. Legacy is what you leave for the history books and the impact you leave on people once you've left them. And so I ask, what legacy does this Prime Minister want to be known for? And to his colleagues, what legacy do they wish for their government? Does this government wish for its legacy to be that it is better to hide your mistakes and wrongdoings if it should suit your purposes? Now, as parliamentarians, we are not the masters but the servants. As I said before, our masters are the Canadian people, and our purposes should fall second to the needs of the Canadian people. The Canadian people need a transparent government and an accountable government. Wasn't that the promise that the Liberals gave those that voted for them in 2015? Is this going to be yet another broken promise by this government? Now, more than ever, with trust in our institutions at an all-time low, we can't afford this sort of tomfoolery. We need to ensure that Canadians can trust us to get things done and that our federal government does not fall into obscurity in the eyes of the Canadian public. It's not too late to right the ship in this instance and come clean to the people of Canada. And today, I hope that this message resonates with my colleagues across the floor. Another question that I have for this government regarding a potential legacy is this. Does this government wish to leave behind lessons that taking a sacred duty to your country as an elective representative is something that can be shrugged at and abused? A recurring theme in this government has been that of conflict of interest, time and time again. Parliamentarians are entrusted with the sacred duty to represent the voices of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. These voices should always supersede those of powerful corporations and investment funds. And common sense Conservatives have been strongly against the presence of corporate lobbyists in our political process. And we will always advocate that the best way for Canadians to influence their parliamentarians is to speak to them directly. The tables have turned. It's the people's time to be heard. One last question. Does this government wish to teach future generations that it's okay to freeze the nation's legislature for more than a month, to shrink from accountability over hundreds of millions of taxpayers' dollars? Well, these are the questions that I hope that every member opposite of me is able to ask themselves in private as they look in the mirror after work today. After all, we are at work, and taxpayers have sent us here to advocate for their best interests. How withholding these documents serves Canadian taxpayers is beyond me, and I, alongside the people I represent in Red Deer Mountain View, would appreciate a more genuine response than a simple non-answer. It's time for us, as adults in the room, to take stock of where we are at as a democracy and to ensure that we are moving forward in a way that best reflects the views and values of the people of Canada. This is a chance for us to show Canadians that we can still get things done in this country for the good of all citizens. It was not always like this in Canada, and it will not be like this forever. The winds of change are setting upon Canada, ready to transform our country once more, as all democracies observe. We are in a transformative time where many things are uncertain, and while there still remains much that we are unsure of, such as what the future holds, one thing remains clear: Canadians deserve better.
Bravo.